Today, we are going to build the ultimate modernized version of the Nintendo 64. We're going to give it a huge graphical upgrade, overclock the CPU for maximum performance, cram it full of features it was never meant to have, and well, that's just the start of a long list of changes that we're going to make to update this thing for 2026. See, the Nintendo 64 is my favorite console of all time, and it's actually the very first console that I modded on this channel. But since then, I have learned way more about console modding, so for the past week or so, I've been researching and planning how we can turn this thing up to 11. Every mod we're gonna do today is going to be bigger, better, and unfortunately for me, more complicated than what I did in the past. But you guys know the deal. Before we can start modding this thing, first we need to tear it down. And given that the system is nearly 30 years old at this point, we should probably fix a few issues while we're in here. After removing no less than a dozen screws, I was able to remove the upper RF shielding, and then after removing a few more, the whole motherboard lifted out like so. Here, we get our first opportunity to check for any major issues. Leaking capacitors are the leading cause of death for these old systems, but thankfully mine all looked really good. So next, I started removing these heatsinks and their dry, crusty thermal pads, which again is another common point of failure. Later, we're gonna do a big cooling upgrade, but first, I wanna show you something that almost nobody talks about when it comes to maintaining these old systems. An interesting quirk of the cartridge slot is that it also kind of has its own cartridge slot, and this area of the board is always disgusting. By cleaning it out, you can basically eliminate the need to blow on your cartridges in order to get them to work. So with that done, I thought it'd be fun to replace the stock LED with a more modern white one. I had this whole bit planned about how white LEDs weren't even commercially available when the N64 first came out, but as it turns out, this mod conflicts with another one we're gonna do later, so we'll just breeze right past it and dive into our first major upgrade that's gonna give this system a huge graphical upgrade. This is the Retro Gem, and compared to the cheap HDMI mod I used on my last Nintendo 64, this thing is like a Rolls Royce. Not only does it add a modern HDMI output so that you can easily connect it to a modern TV, but it also makes the graphics look way better. However, installing it is a little bit tricky. We need to solder this ribbon cable directly to our GPU, and these pins are really small, so performing this mod is infinitely easier with a good digital microscope. I'll include a link to the one I'm using along with all of my other tools down in the video description. By tapping into these pins, we can capture raw digital frames and reroute them to the Retro Gem, where we can perform all sorts of visual enhancements. I'm talking upscaling, smoothing, deinterlacing, and so much more. But here, I think it's important to note that these enhancements don't alter the artist's original intent, but actually better preserve it on modern displays. We'll do a side-by-side comparison later, but I'm getting ahead of myself because we also need to make some connections over here on the PIF chip. By tapping into these pins, the Retro Gem can listen for controller inputs, and it also adds some nice quality of life features like being able to reset the console through software. And then last but not least, we need to give this thing some power. So after carefully folding the flex cable, you need to connect this arm to the output side of this nearby capacitor. And just like that, we are ready to test our first major upgrade. But spoiler alert, this did not go according to plan. Here we go, big moment of truth. Flip the switch. Debugging physical hardware can be an absolute pain, but learning how to build and debug software doesn't have to be, thanks to today's sponsor, Boot.dev. I have been using Boot.dev for the past couple of weeks now, and let me tell you, this is no boring coding bootcamp. Their platform uses video game-like mechanics to subtly trick your brain into learning all the skills necessary to become a modern back-end developer. One thing I truly appreciate is that they start you writing real code right away. We're talking Python, SQL, Linux terminal commands, and so much more. Honestly, they have courses in languages that I've never even heard of before. Plus, there's no sitting through dry lectures. Any theory is delivered in tandem with hands-on problem solving, so you learn these skills by actually doing the work. And all of their read-only content is available for free forever. But if you want to unlock their interactive coding tools, their Discord community, and so much more, you can use the code ZachBuilds to save 25% off of an annual subscription. Either scan the QR code on screen right now or check out the link in the video description. And now, let me show you what went wrong with my HDMI mod. You guys are gonna like this. Off screen, before I got into tearing this thing down again and checking all my solder points, I decided, you know what, this is kind of an old HDMI cable. Maybe I should check with another one. And sure enough, watch this. HDMI 2 here, It boots just fine. So now that we know our new HDMI port works, next I want to address something that's plaguing these old consoles. After nearly 30 years of service, it's very common for these old power supplies to develop all sorts of problems. They rattle, hum, and in extreme cases, they won't even output the right voltages anymore, which can lead to all sorts of weird glitches as various components are starved for power. So rather than trying to fix this thing, I want to build something new from the ground up. And here, the first link in the chain is going to be this USB-C power delivery trigger board. By toggling these 3 tiny dip switches, we can set up this board to request 12 volts of power from a standard USB power adapter, which, lucky for us, is one of the 2 voltages required by the N64. The other is 3.3 volts, and for that, we're gonna use this little buck converter. This guy gets fed with power from the first board and then steps it down to 3.3 volts after you bridge this little contact. And just like that, we have everything we need to power the N64 in a much smaller package. But we still need to connect it back to the motherboard. And here, to create the cleanest possible install, I'm gonna remove the factory power plug. This is gonna free up a ton of space and allow us to connect directly to the system's main power rails. Using a copper wick, I soaked up all the solder holding this port in place, which did unfortunately take a while as there was quite a bit to remove, but that's all that holds this thing in place. So with a gentle little tug, it popped out like so. And now another weird quirk of the N64 is that it draws almost all of its power through that 3.3 volt line. If you do the math, that's a lot of current to try and push through a single wire, so we need to connect not 1, but 2 output wires to our little buck converter. Thankfully, the 12 volt line pulls a lot less current, so a single wire is all you need there. And then the last step was just connecting all those wires to the power rails like I said before. And if you guys want to learn to do mods like this at home, you're going to want to check out my Modders Masterclass. It's a step-by-step instructional course designed to teach you all of the hardware modification skills that I use on this channel. For a limited time, you can use the code Nintendo64 to save 50% off of the cost of admission. Plus, I've even got a special bonus offer that we'll talk about at the end of the video. But right now, we need to test this setup. And the cool thing about this mod is that it should now be possible to power this system with a battery bank. So after plugging one in, I held my breath and flipped the power switch for the very first time. Yes! With that win under our belt, next, I want to tackle something that made people really angry the last time I did this project, and probably rightfully so. In order to add wireless controller support, I used this big, ugly dongle. And the reason it's so big is because it has a slot for a memory card built right into it. So I went in search of a solution, and what I found is this guy. And as you can immediately see, it's way smaller. And the way it does that is by having the memory card integrated right into the adapter. But I was looking at it and I was thinking that this thing is so small, I think we might be able to just fit it right inside of the console. So to test my theory, first I had to open it up. And unfortunately, after trying unsuccessfully to gently pry it apart, I had to resort to some good old-fashioned brute force. With the case sufficiently mangled, the PCB inside pulled out without a fight. And to my delight, this thing works pretty much exactly the way I thought it would. There's 3 main wires that connect back to the controller port, and then the brains of the operation is this ESP32 board running the Blue Retro firmware. And if you've never heard of Blue Retro before, it's this really cool open source project that brings Bluetooth support to all sorts of different retro consoles. So I think all we have to do is connect these 3 wires to the pins on the motherboard where the controller ports are connected. The first wire should deliver power, the second wire is our data line, and then our final wire here is just a ground line. Now, unfortunately, I'm gonna need to do this 3 more times for each of the remaining controller ports, but for now, I'm just curious to see if this setup even works. Light came on right away, that's a good sign. Didn't break the system, it boots. Okay, now, wireless controller. Oh, look at that. So now that we know that the wireless controller system works, next we just need to do it 3 more times. Now I've actually already ordered all the parts to make that happen, but they're still in the mail. So while we wait for those to arrive, I want to install another mod. And this one I am very excited for because up until recently, I didn't even know it was possible. As it turns out, you can actually overclock a Nintendo 64, but the way you do it is kind of unorthodox. This little QSB gets soldered directly to your CPU and forces it to run over 30% faster. But this install had me sweating bullets because in order to attach this thing, first you need to pry up to the legs on your CPU, One wrong move here and I could easily brick my console. But I think it's going to be worth it because apparently this mod will give you huge performance increases in certain games. Plus, I think it's just super cool to say that you have an overclocked Nintendo 64. That being said, not every game will respond well to being overclocked, so now that we've got the chip installed, next we need a way to toggle it on and off. And for that, we are going to be tapping into the same reset line that we soldered to the RetroGem. By connecting this pad back to the QSB, we can turn the overclock on and off by simply holding the reset button for a couple of seconds. Theoretically, this should work, but I also might just be the first person to combine both of these mods at the same time, so we're gonna need to test that. But first, there's still one last part of this mod left to do. We need to replace that white LED that I installed earlier with a new bicolor one. After some quick desoldering, I dropped the new LED into the positive terminal on the motherboard. But rather than soldering it to the ground terminal, I'm actually gonna run these two color-coded wires back to the QSB. This allows the system to switch the LED's color depending on what mode it's in. Red means that it's running at stock clock speeds, and blue means that it's overclocked. So with all of my connections made, I hurried over to my desk to test this thing out, and here, again, things didn't really go according to plan. Hey, it boots, okay. At first, everything seemed great. The system booted just fine. But then, when I tried to activate the overclock, that's when I got this ominous black screen of death. Okay, well, that's not good. It's just black screening on me. And no matter what I did, it just kept happening. Eventually though, I realized that the problem was actually my EverDrive 64, which we're gonna talk more about soon. For some reason, it just doesn't like having the clock speeds changed while it's already running. So long as I'm in a game, everything seems to work just fine. Now we'll do some performance testing at the end of the video, and we're also gonna address the increased heat output thanks to our higher clock speeds. But first, since I already had all of my soldering tools out, I wanna remove the system's original AV port. We don't really need it anymore, and getting rid of it will free up a bunch of space for something that I have planned later. But that's easier said than done because it's held in place with 12 solder anchors. So rather than painstakingly draining each one with a solder wick, I'm just gonna melt them all simultaneously with my hot air station. It did take me about 60 seconds to get them all up to temperature, but once I did, the old port pried out super easily. And now that that's done, we can get back to managing a different type of heat. To start, we're gonna replace these old solid aluminum heat sinks with some thin copper ones. These should do a much better job of removing heat from the chips, and they also look really cool. To make sure they're operating at peak performance though, instead of using traditional thermal pads, I'm gonna be using one of my favorite products, which is K5 Pro. Basically, this stuff is like a smooth spreadable thermal pad, except it's way more efficient at transmitting heat, which should help to keep the chips underneath nice and cool. And then, in addition to that, I also want to turn the N64 into an actively cooled system with the addition of this 40mm fan. By positioning it right about here, we can get it to pull air through all three of our heatsinks. However, powering it is going to be a little bit challenging since the N64 was never designed to have a fan. So here, we're going to have to get a bit creative and turn our attention to this component labeled U13. This guy is the system's main voltage regulator, so by tapping directly into it, we can steal all the juice we need without disrupting any other components. Oh man, seeing this little fan spin up makes me unreasonably happy. But I'm realizing that now that we've installed all of these mods, I think we have a little bit of a problem and also potentially an opportunity. See, I don't think that there's any way we can fit all of this stuff back in the original case. But also, looking at it, you can see that there's really not too much here. So I think we can actually design an entirely new case that's significantly smaller than the original and can fit all of our new parts. So for the next couple of days, that is exactly what I did. I set out to design the smallest modern case possible. And that goal presented me with some interesting challenges that I think are probably best explained with my first prototype. First, I needed somewhere to put all of these new components. With my previous modern N64, I just kind of glued them to the bottom of the case, which created a repairability nightmare. So for this new case, I wanted all the new components to either screw in place like I'm doing here with the RetroGem, or simply press into some plastic clips like I'm doing here with the power supply. The blue Retros were a little bit more complicated because their pairing buttons needed these little extenders, but they also kind of just clip into place. And then next, this HDMI port was probably the hardest one to figure out because I couldn't really screw or clip it down. So instead, I designed this little dog bone that holds it perfectly in place. And while I was designing that, I also made this bracket for our new fan. It'll screw directly to the mounting points on either side of the expansion port, which is also where we are going to put this official RAM expansion pack. I stripped this one down to save space and applied some new copper heat sinks to it to keep it cool. With both of those now installed, I was ready to connect the motherboard and tackle my next two challenges. In my pursuit of making this case as small as possible, I didn't leave enough room for these thick PSU wires to wrap around to the top side of the motherboard where they're going to be connected. The easy answer here would be to just make the case a little bit bigger, but I have a better idea. Instead, we're just going to hack a section right out of this motherboard. And while I know this looks crazy, it isn't that crazy. The outer perimeter of the motherboard is basically just one big ground plane, so I'm pretty sure there aren't any important traces running through this bit. After cleaning up all the rough edges with a file, I was very careful to clean up all the dust because not only is it super conductive, it's also just really bad to breathe in. But on a more positive note, look at how perfectly our wires fit now. So with that done, I had one last issue to attend to, and it's just that the wires on our blue retros are a little too short to reach some of the controller ports. Thankfully, this was a pretty easy fix. After peeling back the protective coating, I was able to desolder the existing wires and then solder in some new longer ones that I can trim to length during the final install. And now, after a very slight redesign of the bottom of the case, we're ready to install everything and move on to the top, which also presented some unique challenges, because this case has moving parts. Both of these switches need extensions that can move without falling out of the case. And I also needed to create some clearance above these parts, which stood above everything else. And here, I'll be honest, I struggled with how to design the top for a while. But then I remembered that this is a problem that somebody else has already solved. After studying the original shell, I was able to basically copy Nintendo's homework and come up with a very similar solution. So I hit print, and 12 hours later, my new case was ready to be assembled. The new power button has this square section that grips a switch inside of the system, and then it has two flexible clips on either side which retain it in the top. It slots in place like so. And when you look at that, it works perfectly on the first try. And then the reset button is largely the same, except it moves up and down instead of backwards and forwards. A quick test of the cartridge slot confirmed everything lined up as it should, and at this point, I was starting to get very excited. Oh man, would you look at that? I love both how this thing looks and also feels. But there is one glaring issue left with this case, and that's just that it isn't clear. If you guys have been watching the channel for a while, you know that I'm a big fan of clear cases for electronics, and that's what I did the last time I made a modern Nintendo 64. But while I was doing it, I learned a very powerful lesson, and I am not going to make that same mistake again. Making clear parts at home takes a lot of time and effort, and to be honest, the whole process isn't very much fun. So this time, I decided to just farm out the work to somebody else. JLC 3DP was willing to print, finish, and ship me the final version of my case for the very reasonable price of like $100, which to me is a bargain considering it frees me up to work on other things like prepping 3 more blue retros. These ones I ordered off of AliExpress, and they were about half as much as the first one, which I bought on Amazon. So if you don't mind waiting a couple of weeks, that's definitely the way to go. And then I also bought something on AliExpress that I am really excited about. Chances are you guys have probably already clocked me using this EverDrive 64 throughout some of my testing. And long story short, this thing is awesome. With it, you can load all of your games onto a single SD card, and then you can pick which game you want to play from a centralized menu. It's a much more modern experience. However, it has one big drawback, and that's just that it's really expensive. So that's why I was so excited to find this guy. This is the Summer Cart 64, and basically it's an open source version of the EverDrive. There are a few key differences between the two, but the one that stood out to me the most is that this guy is like a quarter of the price. Plus, it can play disk drive games. So we're definitely gonna test it out, but before we do that, I think we should assemble our system in our new clear case, which just showed up in the mail. Come on, guard dog, come here. Good work, guard dog. They say some jobs are best left to professionals, and here I was so close to enthusiastically agreeing. My initial inspection of these parts was really positive. Damn, these look so good. If I was nitpicking, there were some small imperfections, but it was still way better than anything I could do at home. Unfortunately, my heart sank when I spotted this big crack right in the front of the case. I contacted JLC 3DP, and after checking their internal photos, they determined that this must have happened somewhere in shipping. They offered me a small discount as compensation, but off camera, I'm probably gonna push for a replacement. That said, at this point, I was too excited to wait, so I pushed forward with the initial assembly. And you know what? Crack aside, this thing looks so good with all the parts installed. As a final cherry on top, I made a custom logo and had it printed out on a sticker, which goes right here. So now that we have everything assembled, the first thing that I have been dying to test out is that CPU overclock. The standard example here is Star Wars Rogue Squadron, which loads significantly faster and plays a lot faster too. But the benefits extend to other games like Perfect Dark, which is notorious for its poor frame rates. The CPU overclock actually made the high-res mode playable, which I was really surprised by. And really, that's the main benefit of this mod. Many games that used to suffer from frame rate drops are now a lot smoother and more playable. Next, I want to take a look at the RetroGen. One of my favorite things about this mod is just how configurable it is. So the first thing I did was crank up the upscaling to 1080p, turn on deinterlacing, and then apply a subtle smoothing layer to everything. So here is what my final video output looks like compared to the original AV port. Not only does it look so much better, but just being able to plug the system into a modern TV with a single cable is very convenient. And speaking of convenience, let's try out our Summer Kart 64. The first thing I noticed here is that the interface isn't quite as polished, but that being said, it does seem to do everything else just about as well. All the features that I really care about are there, things load quickly, and given the price difference, I think the Summer Kart is a real winner. Oh, and like I said before, it does in fact run disk drive games, which I'm definitely gonna have to explore more on my own time. Wireless controllers also work great, as you might imagine. You get all of the subtle Mario movements with your analog stick, and maybe I'm just getting old, but I don't really notice any input latency. Plus, you still have the option to run a wired controller if you want to. Overall, I think this thing looks great. It's like half the size of the original, and it's a huge evolution from the last time I did this project. So that is why I am very excited to give it away to one of you guys at home. Anyone who registers for my Modders Masterclass before August 31st is going to be automatically entered to win it. You can use the code Nintendo64 to save 50% off the price of admission, and the course teaches you everything you need to know to start modding your own game consoles at home. Also, real quick before we go, I want to say a big thank you to Boot.dev for sponsoring this video. To level up your coding skills with interactive game-based learning, click the link in the video description and use the code ZachBuilds to save 25% off your first year.